All right. That's right. You know what that means? It's time to be. Now, see, here's the problem. I'm just going to get immediately on my soapbox, okay? I even hint at taking a week off, and half the class doesn't show up tonight. I'm just saying it's a real thing. It's a real thing. Look around the room, figure out who's not here, and harass them, right? Harass them in a Christ-like manner. Is all I'm saying. Tree is on YouTube. Good to see you, Tree. Robert is on. There's a few people on here. Oh, yeah. Okay, so the numbers are, so people are just moving to the online format. Maybe that's what it is. It's all about the box. They're afraid I'm going to throw the box at them, and they're going to have to talk on microphone. I bet that's what it is. Good evening. Glad that you are here. We are continuing in our long journey through the Old Testament, but I have high hopes today to cover 3 books of the Bible. I don't think it's going to happen, but I think we can at least get through 2. I think we can do it. I'm almost certain we can do it. There's a lot to discuss. We finished Chronicles last time, which, if you remember, is one singular book in the Hebrew Bible. It's just the Chronicles. That's all it's called. And then you have 4 books of the kingdoms, actually 2 books of the kingdoms, but 4 in ours, because there's a little bit of numbers that go on here. 1st and 2nd Samuel is one book in the Hebrew Bible, just called 1st Kingdoms, and 1st and 2nd Kings is one book in the Hebrew Bible, 2nd Kingdom. So 2 books in the Old Testament version, but 4 of ours. Tonight, we jump into a portion of Jewish history that takes place sometime after the Babylonian exile. So if you remember at the end of both Kings and Chronicles, we talked about how Judah is met with a succession of mostly not good kings, and one of them in particular, a guy by the name of Manasseh, makes some really awful decisions that leads God to say, you know what, judgment's coming, hang on to your hats. And though several after him were righteous kings, what was set into motion could not be stopped, and that ultimately resulted in Judah being taken into Babylonian exile. And Nebuchadnezzar comes in, takes them. Of course, the whole sequence of the events that take place in Daniel's book happened during Babylonian exile. Jeremiah talks about this time as well, a period of 70 years that's going to take place, but that God is going to ultimately come back and say, after that 70-year period, I'm not done with you yet. Get ready to go back to the land. I'm going to restore you. And all of the people said, amen. And at the end of Chronicles, we learned of a man named Cyrus, who was king of Persia, who at this point had already taken over the Israelite captivity from Babylon. And Cyrus, this king, announces a decree to let people go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And everyone saw this as a fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy. Cyrus is this great person that God is going to use, even though he's not a follower of Yahweh. He doesn't believe in the one true God, but somehow he's like sort of this earthly ally to Yahweh and allows the Israelites to go back. And that leads us to the Book of Ezra. Now, I want to say up front, you'll notice in the handout, I've given you a little bit of a reading to do at the front. Read it on your own time. It's basically just an overview, if you will, of the Assyrian kings and so on and so forth, and some years and gaps and things of that nature. If you actually go to the back, you'll see the passages that we're going to be dealing with in tonight's study, and you'll notice, again, I've done this weird thing where I've combined books into one study, Ezra Nehemiah. Now, why would I have done that? Anyone want to take a guess? Oh, and there it is. Josh for the win. Kathy wasn't wrong, but yeah, they're basically about the same thing because actually in the Hebrew Bible, they're one book. Ezra and Nehemiah is just one book. Ezra and Nehemiah is seen as one singular unit. They're not divided up until many, many years after that. And they're actually, it's kind of low-key disappointing for Zerubbabel because really there are three major characters in this sequence of narrative, and Zerubbabel takes a pretty large portion of it, like 6 chapters, and yet he doesn't get a book of his own, right? He just is lumped into Ezra. So I don't know how that happened. Maybe it's just that English speakers were like, we don't want to have to say Zerubbabel every time we turn to that book. So let's just throw him in Ezra, and then all we got to do is say Ezra, right? I'm just guessing. I don't know if that's true or not. But there are 3 main characters in Ezra and Nehemiah. Zerubbabel, who is the primary protagonist in Ezra 1 through 6. And then actually after chapter 6, there's a 60-year gap. And then chapter 7 through 10 deals with Ezra. And then Nehemiah 1 through 7, you get primarily Nehemiah's story. And then after that, there's more chapters, and it's kind of all 3 of them at that point, which is really pretty interesting. Every time I think of Ezra, I think of this Saturday Night Live sketch that none of you are going to understand unless you followed 90s music. It was a Weekend Update episode where Better Than Ezra, the smash band from the early mid-90s, was number 1. And I remember, I think it was Norm Macdonald doing the Weekend Update. And he was like, number 1 on the charts this week was Better Than Ezra. Number 2, Ezra. And I always thought that was really funny. Glad to see it still holds, still carries. Norm was great. Ezra. So let's begin. Let me just kind of give you a base understanding of what happens in this story. It can be seen in several different scenes, but essentially this is what happens. Cyrus gives a decree that is seen as a fulfillment of Jeremiah chapter 25. Zerubbabel is to go back and build the temple. After some time has passed, it takes a long time to do that. The temple is built. And then Ezra comes, and he is going to reestablish God's law, the Torah. And so we have a temple now. Now we have the Torah. We are going to institute ultra reform. The law is going to take the main stage once more. The people of God are going to be unified around God's word, and blessings are going to rain down in torrential downfall. What was I trying to say there? After that, Nehemiah is going to come in and decide, hey, listen, things are great in the land, except lots of people outside of the land want to make their way in, and we need a wall, right? And we're going to make Mexico pay. I'm not going to say that. So what happens is Nehemiah is sent back to build the wall, establish protection for the people of God, and there's this whole weird thing where, like, they're wanting to attack while the wall's being built, and so he's like, with one hand, men were holding swords, and the other, they're laying bricks, and it was just this very hostile environment. All that to say, the book ends in this sort of culminating anticlimax that's really, honestly, kind of depressing. And it leaves the reader wondering, what happened? What was the point of these stories? What was the big idea here? And I've written it down, but don't jump ahead. Let's read through it, and then we'll get to it. Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. This is the prophecy fulfilled. So this is kind of the bigger version of what we ended with last time we met in 2 Chronicles 36:22. It says this: in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all of his kingdom, and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. And let him go up by Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of Yahweh, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let each survivor in whatever place he sojourns be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides freewill offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. So Chronicles tells us that Cyrus makes this proclamation that he's stirred up. Ezra's going to give us just a little more detail, right? Not a whole lot, but a little more. So what do we know? We know that Yahweh is the one stirring him up. That this is a direct fulfillment of Jeremiah 29:10. We don't even have to argue about that. This isn't even an interpretation. This is literally the Bible telling us this, which is really helpful. It's always handy when that happens. If you're interested in what Jeremiah 29:10 says, which I know you are, it's a Bible study, it reads this way: Thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you, and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. You know what he says after that? Everyone's favorite coffee cup Bible verse. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. And then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you, and you will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart, and it will be found by you. You know, the funny thing about that passage, let me just, again, soapbox for a minute. I'm in a mood tonight, what can I say? Is that it's a verse that's like put up on this pedestal of like, look at how great and gracious and wonderful God is. And he certainly is. I mean, there's no question about that. But he literally just said, I'm about to send you to prison for 70 years. Like the verse before it, right? I mean, the context matters so much. I'm about to punish you greatly for your insolence. 70 years you're going to spend in a foreign land. And then I will bring you back. For I know the plans I have. I don't know. Anyways, it's fine. So the prophecy is fulfilled. Cyrus is the voice by which God uses to bring about, enact a decree that brings the people out of bondage and back into the land. So Ezra 1 begins with this like great sense of hope, right? The people have been in captivity. It's been 70 years. Things have been very bad, but we have hope. Because what God said through Jeremiah is coming true. The king just said it. It's happening. It's going down. We're going back to the land. We're going to have a temple again. It's going to be amazing. Remember Leviticus 9 and 1 Kings when God's presence was like in the temple and there was all this crazy stuff going on. We're going back there. It's going to happen. It's going to be amazing, right? So it starts out awesome. But let's keep reading. Ezra 3, I love this passage, verses 10 through 13. It's hilarious. Okay, so hold on. First of all, let me go back a little bit. Leviticus 9. We're going to read these passages because I think it's just really fantastic to put them in their perspective. Leviticus 9. So in this passage, I don't want to read the whole thing, but there's this whole portion of Moses and Aaron offering all of these different offerings. And verse 7, it says, Then Moses said to Aaron, Draw near to the altar and offer your sin offering, your burnt offering, and make atonement for yourself and for the people, and bring the offering of the people and make atonement. This is an incredible picture of what the atonement offering looks like. And it's very detailed, the burnt heads and entrails, and I mean, it's pretty gruesome, actually. But it's totally awesome. At the very end, it says, And Moses and Aaron went to the tent of meeting. This is in verse 23. And when they came out, they blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all of the people. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the pieces of fat on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted, and they fell on their faces. I mean, this is incredible imagery, right? God's presence coming by form of fire to accept the offering that they're making in like glorious fashion. It's an amazing image, actually. You get to 1 Kings chapter 8, and there's a very similar kind of thing going on here, where there's this like remarkable, the ark is brought into the temple, and Solomon blesses the Lord, and this is when he prayed that whole prayer that we talked about, look down from heaven and hear the prayers of your servants, and so on and so forth, and then he gives this sacrifice near the end of that chapter, and it says the Lord appears to Solomon before all the people. It's this remarkable thing. So the temple is hugely important, because this is where God's presence dwells, it's where God's presence is felt, and literally where it's seen in supernatural fashion. So Zerubbabel issues all of these commands to build the temple. And it's fantastic. Let's talk about it. Go back to verse 8. Now in the second year after their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, in the second month, Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Jeshua the son of Jozadak made a beginning, together with the rest of their kinsmen, the priests and Levites, and all who had come to Jerusalem from the captivity. They appointed the Levites from 24 years old and upward to supervise the work of the house of the Lord. I think there's a lot of wisdom there. 21 and 22-year-olds supervising the work of the house of the Lord, it's not a good idea. If you've seen 21 and 22-year-olds, I've been one. I was an idiot, right? I mean, they're just terrible, terrible. 24 and up, very wise. Love that. It says, verse 10, and when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments came forward with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals to praise the Lord according to the direction of King David. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to God, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. They sang responsively. Worship should be responsive to some degree. Kelsey, what is that song that everyone hates that we love? Is he worthy? Yeah, and like people hated that song. I'm like, guys, read Ezra, right? Like you're supposed to worship responsively sometimes, and it's a great song. It's good. It should come back. Absolutely, you heard it here first. It's coming back. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But this is where it gets good, verse 12. But many of the priests and Levites and heads of fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first temple, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though many shouted for joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of joyful shout from the sound of people's weeping. For the people shouted with a great shout, and the sound was heard far away. It's like, I saw this meme today, and it was like how far the Texas Rangers had come. And it was like, in the 60s, and then like the old ballpark, and then the ballpark in Arlington, and now Globe Life Field. And I mean, the comments were filled with old Levites weeping for the former glory of the house of the Rangers. I mean, they were like, why do we have to change it? And, this is what's going on here. These guys had seen the original temple, and they're like, this sucks. You guys ruined it, right? Like, it used to be so much better than this, and you rebuilt it, and it's all modern now, and it's terrible. Notably, what is not happening in this temple is what? How about fire consuming sacrifices and the presence of God being visibly felt and seen? And yeah, right? Like, so that's notable. What they thought would happen in the temple isn't happening. That seems, pretty awful. But we keep reading. We have the scribal beginnings. Now understand, chapter 7, 60 years have passed now since the end of chapter 6. So a lot of time has taken place. Zerubbabel at this point is very old. And it says that in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia. So it's not even the same king at this point, right? Cyrus is the one that let this initial group go. Artaxerxes is now king. And it says that Ezra, son of Sariah, son of Azariah, son of Hilkiah, son of Shallum, son of Zadok, son of Ahitub, son of Amariah, son of Azariah, second Azariah, by the way, if you're keeping count, son of Marioth, and son of Zerahiah, son of Uzi, son of Buki, son of Abishua, son of Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the chief priest. Now, I read all of that to get to that last point. That's why that's there, right? Ezra is a descendant of Aaron. It's a big deal. It's a very big deal, because that means he's a priest, and not just any priest. He's a part of the Aaronic priesthood, which makes him a candidate for high priest, which is a big deal, right? Kind of a big deal. This Ezra went up from Babylonia. He was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses that the Lord God of Israel had given, and the king granted him all that he asked, for the hand of the Lord was on him. Go down to verse 6. So, he is skilled, the hand of the Lord is on him, everything he asked from the king, he's given. Things are going very well for Ezra, all right? And he is notably a not only priest and Aaronic descendant, but he is also a scribe. That's very fascinating. That puts him in an even more unique category. So Ezra's kind of a big deal. Kind of a big deal. If we keep reading, chapter 8, it says that Ezra reads the law. Ezra reads the law. And as he is reading the law, he is coming up with all of these things that were, at this point, completely unknown to Israel. This is important. This is very important. The people at this point, you have to understand how, so going all the way back to Kings or Chronicles, the moral slide and the theological slide began to take place hundreds of years prior to this. And if you remember, Hezekiah is the one that found the law and began reading it, and we're like, oh my gosh, we've been doing everything wrong. At that point, they were already so far adrift from the law that it was like shocking to them when they read it. They have gone years after that, eventually into captivity, where they spent 70 years in Babylon, and then another 60 additional years under the reign of Artaxerxes. Like, they're very far from God's law at this point. They have no real idea about what is going on. And so the priest, Ezra sends for Levites first. There's fasting and prayer. Priests come to guard the offerings. They are building up a temple practice that is brand new to the Levites, to the priesthood. The people aren't even involved in this yet. Like they're prepping, they're giving offerings, but they're not even really fully aware of the weight of what is about to happen. And then we get to chapter 10, and this is where I'll take questions at the end of Ezra. I know I normally do it after each passage, but I think it's easier for these two books to sort of summarize, and then we can talk. What Ezra figures out is that a lot of the people coming back from captivity are coming back to worship in the assembly. Well, Ezra's been reading the law. He's been studying up to figure out how all this works. And one of the things that he remembers or reads and is reminded of comes out of Deuteronomy 23, verses 1 through 4, right? Very end of Deuteronomy, or near the end of it, not quite the very end. There's a few more chapters after that. But Deuteronomy 23, 1 through 4 says this. I'm going to start, let's see here, in verse 2. I'll start with verse 1, it's fine. No one whose testicles are crushed or whose male organ is cut off shall enter the assembly of God. Okay, that's not really the point I was getting at, but that's fine. No one born of a forbidden union may enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of his descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and with water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, the son of Beor, from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you. He goes on and says, but you shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, because you were a sojourner in his land. Children born to them in the 3rd generation may enter the assembly. So the Edomites, by the way, are descendants of who? Anyone remember? What was it? Esau. Who said that? Was that you? Yeah, Esau's correct. They are Edomites. They are the ones who are going to bring forth a great amount of destruction and problems against the Israelites in the minor prophet of, which one is that? I can't remember actually off the top of my head. I should know that. Anyways, it doesn't matter. We'll get to it eventually. But there are some problems here, right? So if you are down to a 10th generation of a forbidden marriage assembly, or you are any generation of Ammonite or Moabite, you are strictly forbidden not to enter the assembly of the Lord and the temple. Now, here's why that's relevant. Because they've just rebuilt the temple. And they're coming back from where? Babylon. And what do you think a lot of those guys did while they were in Babylon? Yeah, got married to Babylonian women. To Babylonian. That was terrible. I shouldn't have said that. So they get married. And they have children, and they have families. And then they're like, yeah, honey, you'll be great. They'll love you. It was wonderful when I lived where my fathers lived there. Let's go back home. We'll bring Johnny and whatever the daughter's name is, Julie, right? Almost certainly not Johnny and Julie. So they get back, and Ezra begins to read the law. And very awkward, right? Yes. All of a sudden, Johnny and Julie and Mrs. Bride are not welcome. In fact, they're not only not welcome, but Ezra gets like extremely radical, right? He says in verse 1, when Ezra prayed and made confession, weeping and casting himself down before the house of God, a very great assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him out of Israel, for the people wept bitterly. And Shechaniah the son of Jehiel and the sons of Elam addressed Ezra, we have broken faith with our God and have married foreign women from the peoples of the land, but even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. Therefore, let us make a covenant with our God to put away all these wives and their children according to the counsel of you, talking to Ezra, my Lord, and those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law. Arise, for it is your task, and we are with you. Be strong and do it. And then Ezra arose and made the leading priests and Levites and all of Israel take an oath that they would do as they had said, and so they took an oath. So, first church service in, 150 years, and pastor gets up and says, well, the message is out of Deuteronomy this morning, and here's what God wants you to know, that the woman sitting next to you that you love and cherish, and those beautiful children she's given you, they're being deported, and you're going to divorce them, and they're not allowed to live here anymore. And then Ezra ends. Now, luckily, for history's sake, it doesn't end, because remember, it's one book, and so Nehemiah comes and continues the story, and so it's not quite as dark of an ending as we might think it is initially. But let's talk about this for a minute. How do we feel about this? This seems extremely radical and extremely, hostile in a bad way, in a not good way. So let me just say, first of all, there are a couple of passages that come to mind with regard to this. One is out of Malachi, chapter 2, verses 13 through 16. It says this, and this second thing you do, you cover the Lord's altar with tears, with weeping and groaning, because he no longer regards the offerings or accepts it with favor from your hand. That sounds an awful lot about like what was going on in Ezra's time. But you say, why does he not? Because the Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. Did he not make them one with a portion of the Spirit in their union? And what was the one God seeking? Godly offspring. So guard yourselves in your spirit, and let none of you be faithless to the wife of your youth. For the man who does not love his wife but divorces her, says the Lord, the God of Israel, covers his garment with violence, says the Lord of hosts. So guard yourselves in your spirit and do not be faithless. Does God not hate divorce? He does. Now, there are times in the Old and New Testament where divorce is granted. Certainly. No question. Affairs. Jesus gives that very clearly. Paul goes on to say, if you are married to an unbelieving spouse and they desert you, don't follow after them, but let them leave you, right? There are instances in which that works itself out on a practical level that become a lot more nuanced. And my goal here tonight is not to have a whole talk about like when it's appropriate to have a divorce and when it's not. Hopefully, it never happens. But there are instances in which God says it's permissible. That's a good word. Not wanted, not loved, but permissible for the protection of one or both of those individuals. But none of those things happened in this Ezra passage, number one. They were married to outsiders, but the whole idea, they themselves were outsiders. So it seems a little weird to conflate this with what's going on. Secondly, the law specifically prohibits marriage to Ammonites, Moabites, and about 5 or 6 other Canaanite tribes in the Torah. to my knowledge, Babylon is not one of them. So you could make a case that these were not marriages that were not permissible at all. But third, and most importantly, where is God in the midst of all of this story? What I mean by that is literally, where is he in this? The answer is, he's silent. This is Ezra telling them to do this. It's really actually the people telling Ezra to do this, and he kind of folds under what looks a little bit like political pressure for the purity of the nation, which wasn't necessarily wrong, but it maybe also wasn't necessarily clear. Either way, it does not say that God came to Ezra and told him all these men need to divorce their wives and send their children home. Never says that. And that actually seems quite counter to the heart of God with regard to the sojourner, the alien, so on and so forth, who he says, when they come in, receive them, care for them, love them, in hopes that they may become followers of Yahweh. There's no reason to think that these wives and these children were not there to kind of jump in and become Israelites. They were going back to Israel, right? So it's a weird story. It's a weird story because it doesn't, on the one hand, you can make an argument for what Ezra is doing here, but there's some notable things missing, and there's some notable things that are not quite clear enough for me to go, yeah, this is definitely what God wanted. And in fact, in other passages, it seems like maybe this is not what he wanted. Any questions, concerns, comments so far? And I do have the catch box. Don't worry, it's right here. Anyone? No? Yeah? Okay, here. I'm going to pass this to you, and then you pass it to her. Perfect. Look at us. It's like sports and Bible study. Who knew that could be done?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. So, like we talked about with the prophets, so basically they were the mouthpiece of God, right? So that what they said had to be true or they would be, taken out.
Right.
So when Ezra is proclaiming here, like, you're being disobedient in chapter 10 and all of that, if it wasn't from God, wouldn't he be killed?
Well, yes, so good question, except for Ezra's not called a prophet.
Oh, okay.
So he's a priest and he's a scribe.
Okay.
So he's an important teacher, but he's not necessarily prophetic in that sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what does it mean in chapter 10 when they say there in verse, I think it's 3, it says, in accordance with the counsel of the Lord and of those who fear the commands of our God, they're going to make a covenant to divorce their wives.
Wait, where's this verse what?
In chapter 10, verse 3, when the people are telling Ezra, now let us make a covenant before our God to send away all these women and their children in accordance with the counsel of my Lord. Does that mean Ezra or the Lord?
Yeah,
okay.
So it's lowercase, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, in accordance with the counsel of Ezra.
Okay, so they haven't been talking to God about this. Okay. Here.
Oh, over here? Yep. Go ahead and.
Oh my goodness, it's weird. I went to one time to a Bible study, and they say that Ezra was really the priest who input the adoration in the church. You say that God was silent, so it can be. Is that true?
No. So when I say God was silent, what I mean is particularly in this part of the story. So clearly, God, the hand of God, the Spirit of God is stirring him up. I mean, we learned all that in chapter 7 about Ezra. The Lord was working through Ezra. Ezra did a lot of great things. So I don't want to cast aspersion upon him in every way. I think he was absolutely doing a lot of the right stuff. But here's what it feels like a little bit. It feels like Ezra became radically conservative with regard to the Torah in such a way that there was almost a politicking going on in how he was going about some of this. So we want purity of Israel, right? So what that could mean is everyone observes the ordinances and the teachings and the commandments of the Torah, or else you're out. But Ezra takes it a step further and is like, if you're not a full-blooded Israelite, you're gone. There's a little bit of an issue with that. they're doing this on the basis of an unholy matrimony or an impure marriage arrangement, right? But the impure marriage arrangements are specifically defined in the Torah. And I may be wrong about this. I still don't think it changes my overall perspective, but I think that Babylon is not a part of that. Babylon is not Canaanite. They're a different group. And so the whole point, the whole purpose of protecting Israel from a purity standpoint in the Old Testament, particularly from Ammonites, Moabites, and Canaanites, was to preserve the purity of theology in Israel so that they would not go after foreign gods. And all of their problems really begin when they don't fully remove all of these people from the land. They were commanded to, and they don't. They just settle in their midst. And so these religious practices over hundreds of years start to intermingle with some of the Israelites. And that in turn leads to idolatry and loads of it, such that even kings begin practicing it. This is how Israel finds its downfall. So it's a different thing than what's going on. The Israelites married outsiders, but really actually they were the outsider that the Babylonians married. Some of the people living in Babylon chose to marry foreigners that were being held captive in their land. And the first moment they got to go back to Israel, they went. That doesn't sound to me like a group that's trying to intermingle their own religion into the Israelite practices. That sounds like a group of people who are going with their family to adopt the practices of the head of their household. So it just feels a bit forced. It feels a bit forced. And this is not the only example, right? So there's a lot of other examples, and there's a lot of other conflict that we've kind of skipped over because, again, I'm just looking at fascinating portions here of the text. But there's a lot of stuff in here that seems like very radical and forced beyond what the Scripture dictates. Would you toss that back to him and then back to, yes, we have another question all the way back. Alley-oop. Oh, who? Oh, yeah. Did you have one? No. Okay, yeah. Then back over.
I just had a quick question. But Ruth was from Moab, right? Wasn't she a Moabite? And so David's lineage, would he be not allowed, David's line not be allowed in the assembly?
Ding, 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 ding. Yeah, it's good.
So wouldn't that contradict everything, though? Because David was supposed to be the Jesus prototype.
Yeah, you would think. But Ruth and that whole situation is there's more going on there from the Jewish law perspective, where she actually, yeah, there's more going on there. It wasn't just like an intermarriage. That was practicing something that was to buy the land back. And there's this whole like law-centered reason for why Boaz marries her. And so it kind of moves her into a category away from Moab and back into sort of the Israelite context. But I think the foreshadowing is very intentional, right? At the end of the day, all of these people find their heritage in one man, Noah. I mean, ultimately Adam, but you know what I mean. One man. I mean, he has 3 sons, and these 3 sons propagate all of these people groups. And so this is one of the reasons why Genesis is such a profoundly important book, because it was written during the time of Moses when the enemies are occupying our land that we are supposed to have, that God gave us, that they are against us and they want to war against us and kill us, and they're the worst, and they're our arch nemesis, and they're this and that, and then they're reading Genesis and they're like, oh, wait, they're our cousins. Right? I mean, so that's the point of that. You only get so far before you realize, like, yeah, we all have kind of one source. Which is why God's goal in the Old Testament, as it is in the New Testament, was to go out and proselytize the world in such a way that it brings them to the truth. The problem is that Israel just sucked at it. They were too busy with their own stuff, their own kingdom, and idolatry. Good question. Yep, up here. You want to turn around and just, oh yeah, look at us. We're like a team, man.
All right. Okay, so you're talking about this point about how the issue with marrying foreigners is specifically theology related. So when the term foreign or foreigners is used in the Old Testament, is that always meant to be Canaanites, Moabites, the
No.
others that I don't remember? No.
No. So typically it's the word alien is how we translate it. And it's anyone who is outside of the land. Now, there are specific people that God is very interested in ending, like the Amalekites, for example. He's like, I'm going to remove them from history. But yes, even the Moabite and the Ammonite could come into the land and were treated as an alien and were to be cared for and loved. They just couldn't enter the assembly. So they would be like a Gentile worshiper in the Old Testament, which they would call them a God-fearer, right? They're not Jewish, so they don't have the right to the full assembly, and they don't have the right to certain sacrifices and whatnot, but they're permissible to be there. But the idea behind it, and this is why, gosh, again, not to get like overly political, but you know, the whole concept of immigration and you'll hear people on the side that thinks that like just everybody should be allowed to come and bring customs and you don't have to do anything or whatever, will appeal to certain Bible verses like this, like love the alien and you know, receive them and provide for them and so on and so forth. And like, yeah, I believe that. But when you keep reading, what you find out is the alien has responsibility to adapt to Israel's standards, to worship God, and to follow the course of what Israel's doing. No one wants that in the real world, right? That seems oppressive. So it's like we got to understand the full context of what care for the alien looked like. What it meant was, come in, let us care for you, let us love you, and become one of us.
You can show up, but you got to participate.
Yeah, you're going to be here. You're going to be one of us. You're going to follow our customs. And if not, right? Yeah. Very good. Questions? Good over here, Tyler. No questions over here? Good. All right. Sweet. All right, Nehemiah. Let's talk about this because it just keeps going. A continuation. The words, this is Nehemiah 1:1. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakkalah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. Now, notice in verse 1, it says, in the 20th year. The great question is, in the 20th year of what? So remember that this is a continuation of Ezra. It's one book. So this would be the 20th year of Artaxerxes, king of Persia. That's what this is being measured by. So this is not that much farther after Ezra's time. They are there, they're instituting Torah, the temple is built, but they are in great trouble because the wall is broken. Nehemiah prays, Artaxerxes grants him actually he first becomes cupbearer to the king, and then it says, in the month of Nisan in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. King notices he's sad, and Artaxerxes tells him why, and ultimately he is permitted access to go back to build the wall and to have all the things that he needs in order to make it happen. It's a very generous offer from Artaxerxes. And so this whole thing takes place. He goes, and chapters 1 through 7 deal with everything that happens. Nehemiah inspects the wall. The rebuilding of the wall takes place. There's opposition to the work. There's this whole fight that takes place. Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites. There's all this war going on. The work resumes. Nehemiah begins doing things that are very noble. There's a lot of oppression of the poor. He stops that. He's quite generous, actually. There's a conspiracy against him. Again, more drama that takes place. And then the wall is finished. And we get to chapter 7, and we get this list of the returned exiles. And there's this just long list of numbers. And I'm going to read every one of them right now. I'm just kidding. I'm not going to do that to you. It says that all the temple servants and the sons of Solomon's servants were 392. This is in verse 60 of chapter 7. It goes on and it gives the total of the people and the gifts that were given for the temple and for the wall. And then we get to chapter 8 again, and Ezra reads the law, this time to everyone. So Ezra is there, okay? The wall is built. Nehemiah is there. Zerubbabel is very old at this point, but still kicking. And this is what it says. Let's see here. And the people gathered as one man into the square before the water gate, and they told Ezra, the scribe, to bring the book of the law of Moses that the Lord had commanded Israel. And so Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly, both men and women, and all who could understand what they heard, on the first day of the 7th month. And he read it from facing the square before the water gate from early morning until midday, in the presence of the men and the women and those who could understand. And all the ears of the people were attentive to the book of the law. And Ezra the scribe stood on a wooden platform that they had made for that purpose, and beside him stood Mattithiah, Shema, Ananiah, Uriah, Hilkiah, and Maaseiah on the right hand, and Pedaiah, Mishael, Malchijah, Hashem, Hashbadanath, Zechariah, and Meshullam on his left. And Ezra opened the book in the sight of all the people, for he was above all the people. And as he opened it, all the people stood. So from this point on, every time I open the Bible, you are going to stand. I'm just kidding. And Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God, and all the people answered, Amen, Amen, lifting up their hands, and they bowed their heads, and they worshipped Yahweh with their faces to the ground. And it says in verse 8, they read from the book, from the law of God clearly, and they gave the sense so that the people understood the reading. And then it goes through and it talks about a bunch of different things that are really fascinating. The people confess their sin. The Feast of Booths is celebrated. This is a very important festival that goes all the way into the Gospels. Jesus in, John chapter 10 goes when the Feast of Booths is being celebrated. So these are well-known feasts that we see all the way up into the New Testament times that Israel is still practicing. The obligations of the covenant are read. And then we get to chapter 13, and these are the final reforms. And again, we deal with this intermarriage issue. It says, in those days I saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. And I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair, and I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. Did not King Solomon of Israel sin on account of such women? Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God made him king over all of Israel, and nevertheless the foreign women made even him to sin. Shall we then listen to you and do all this great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women? So again, there's like this purity issue of race that comes to the table. And it ends this way. Thus I cleansed them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and Levites in each of his work, and I had provided the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. Nehemiah ends, and things are still kind of in an upheaval. So this is what's interesting, is that Ezra and Nehemiah begins with this great hope that God is going to fulfill the promises of Jeremiah 25 and bring the people back to the land, and the temple is going to be built, and Ezra the priest is sent, and Nehemiah comes and builds the wall, and it seems like everything that should bring fulfillment to the people of God has happened, and yet no one has experienced any kind of heart change, and so the book ends with as much turmoil as it began with. All of the institution of all the laws and all the practices were there, but they were still the same old people. Contentious, sinful, political, not good. It speaks to the reality that you can reform practice, but if you do not reform heart, you're left with nothing good. It's the same old song and dance. We got a question back here. Do I have the box? Oh, he's got the box. Throw it back. Ooh, you're going to go for, okay, the short pass. I can respect that. It's a par 3. It's fine. Yeah, it's good. Okay.
I just had a quick question. As you're saying over and over, God is telling them, don't marry foreign women. What about Israelite women marrying foreign men? Because the women didn't really have any rights back then, so why would the women make them impure when the males ruled over the households? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things to consider. But one, you have to understand, regrettably, that the emphasis of women's practices are quite less substantial than the practices of men. So daughters marrying foreign men, not as big of a deal in the sense that there's no control over the same things you would have control over if the son was marrying a daughter. It sounds really bad. It is what it was. All that to say, the how do I say this? What we're going to find out in a minute is that when Israelite women marry foreign men, God has a propensity to use them to change things for the good of Israel far more than he does when Israelite men marry foreign women. I'll just leave it at that. I think that the overwhelming pattern is that when Israelite men choose to intermarry, it usually is not for the right reasons, and it's not good. They have the choice to do that, and they choose it, and it ends up with idolatry and sin. When Israelite women marry foreign men, it is typically a choice that is not left up to them, and God actually uses them to bring change for the better of his people. I don't know if that's a sufficient answer.
No, it's just confusing because it keeps blaming the impurity of the race on the female when the female had no rights back then.
Well, so in this passage, the female is talking about the female foreigners. They don't know the language of the people. Mm-hmm. That's the issue that he's getting at. But that's really still blaming the men because they're the ones that married her.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can just hang on to it for now. Use it as a pillow. Any other questions? All right. Going once, going twice. Do we have any online? Any people? Ooh, we've got some stuff. Hold on. Let's see here. Franklin's are here. Good to see you. Hola. That was her, not me. We've got another Spanish speaker in the house. Tree says, look, I have a sore throat. Well, Tree, I can't look. I can't see you. You can see me. Let's see here. Linda, hi. Hello. We have 8 listening here. Wow. That's awesome. Hello, hi, and welcome to all of you. Let's see here. Carol's on. Melanie and Trey are on. Hello. What if the wives became believers? Did they still have to divorce? Well, Tree, so that's a good question. What if the wives became believers? Did they still have to divorce? We're not really given the chance for that. That's part of the problem that I have with this, is that it seems like that's what they're doing, and there's nothing given for that. So that's a good question. All right. If nothing else, let's jump into Esther, because Esther is one of my favorites. I love this book because it's crazy and it's awesome, and it is such an unlikely book to be in the Bible. Notably, because of the theme that I have written down here under themes, which is that God is never mentioned. Isn't that strange? God is never mentioned once in Esther. Why is it in the Bible? Well, there's a lot of reasons why it's in the Bible. And God is very much present in Esther, though he is not mentioned. That's what we're going to find out. Esther is a book that takes place about an Israelite woman who marries a foreign man. So I knew we were coming here. That's why I said what I said. She is put in this really strange position. So Esther is, it begins in the days of Ahasuerus, I don't know how to say his name. It's one of the ones that I just have never practiced, who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. And in those days, the king sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all the officials and the servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. So pretty big celebration of himself. And the king is married to Queen Vashti. And it says, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zathar, and Carcass. Carcass, what an unfortunate name. The 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of the king to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. She's like, I'm not a remote that you're going to control, right? That's not what she said literally. It's kind of what we're seeing from her, though. She doesn't really want to be... Anyways. So this makes him mad. He doesn't like this, and so he writes this really weird decree that in the land, any man can be the master of his own home and command anyone in his home to do anything. And then at that point, he decides to have this like really awkward sort of like soapbox drama beauty pageant where he just brings all the women forth from the kingdom to decide like who's going to be the next lucky lady, right? And Esther, a Jewish woman, conceals her identity and enters into the beauty pageant and wins. She wins. Unbelievable, man. Very, very fascinating. Who is Esther? Chapter 2, verses 5 through 11 says this. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's orders and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in custody of Hegai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in custody, who had charge over the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food. And with you get makeup and food. I mean, I just think that's wow. And with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best palace in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So things get very good, at least from a materialistic standpoint, for Esther very quickly. I did want to mention, I skipped over this in 1:13. It says that the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment. Those wise men are almost certainly the same wise men that we find in Daniel, because this is from Babylon and into Persia, and also in Matthew chapter 2, who are consulted by Herod. So just interesting. These are, the wise men, the magi, if you will, right? Just wanted to point that out, just to make some connections across the Bible. Okay, so this is Esther. And then we find the antagonist, a man by the name of Haman. Chapter 3, verse 1. After these things, the king promoted Haman the Agagite. So do you remember Agag? Does that name ring a bell to any of you? It's a pretty, I don't know, it's a memorable name to me, but maybe it's just because I thought the story was so outrageous that I remember it. So in Numbers 24:7, we get Agag. There's a whole story about this. And then in Samuel, remember when Saul refused to kill all of the Amalekites and their king named Agag? And it says he hacked him to pieces. That whole story, remember that? It was really brutal. So yeah, Agag, this is his descendancy. This Haman character is somehow related to these people, who are, spoiler alert, not good people. All right? That should cue you off. The king advances him and set his throne above all the other officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate and all the king's men couldn't put, I'm just kidding, bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. And then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. And so as they made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all of the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom. Now after this, there is this wild scenario that takes place where Haman comes to the king and he's like, look, these Jewish people are terrible. We need to kill them. And what better way to decide what date we kill them but to roll the dice, right? Which in Jewish terms was a pur, P-U-R, okay? Name for the dice. So they roll the dice. They decide on this day in the 12th year of Adar, on the month of Adar. This is when we're going to put all of the Jews to death, which is like a little bit of ways away. And so there's this like level of gloating that's taking place, like your day's coming, right? Adar's coming that month, 12th day, right? You're out of here. We're gonna knock all y'all off. And Mordecai is obviously freaked out by this. So Mordecai and Esther begin to plot on a way to preserve the people and hopefully reverse what has happened. And so Esther comes up with a plan. She has a banquet that she sets up, and she tells both the king and Haman to come, and she feeds them, and it's this excellent banquet, and there's all these great things. And she says, if I have found favor in the sight of my king, and if it pleases the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to my feast that I will prepare for them. And so they do. And Haman, in the meantime, plans to murder Mordecai. So the king and Haman leave the banquet. They're a little bit drunk, and the king decides, as he is leaving, to go to his quarters, and Haman goes to his, and he sees Mordecai out in the streets, and it just makes him furious. And so in kind of this drunken stupor, he tells his guys, I want you guys to erect a large post, a large sharp post, because we are going to throw Mordecai down on it and impale him tomorrow. He's done. Meanwhile, the king goes home, he falls asleep, but he can't really sleep well, and so he has one of the chroniclers of the kingdom come and read to him the chronicles of the kingdom. And in this, they happen to tell this story about Mordecai, which I skipped over, but as I'm going to tell you now, is very important. So when Esther is coming into power, she's still a candidate for being married to the king. She's married to the king at this point, but she's still in candidacy. Mordecai overhears two guards plot to kill the king, and he tells Esther, and Esther tells the king, and the king has them murdered, and Mordecai gets the credit. And so he's this like, yeah, you saved the king's life. Well, the chroniclers happen to open the book to that story, and the king remembers, oh yeah, Mordecai's that guy that saved my life. And so in the morning, Haman comes because he can't have Mordecai killed on his own, and he has to get permission from the king. And so he knocks on the door and he says, oh king, I have something I need to talk with you about. I need your permission, something with regard to Mordecai. And the king says, I'm glad you mentioned him. I want you to put him on a horse and lead him through the kingdom and have the people heap glory and praise upon him because he saved my life. This is a huge pivotal moment in the story. Haman is now humiliated. He has to take Mordecai on this stupid horse and walk all through the kingdom, and all the people are happy about Mordecai because he's this great guy that saved the king's life. Not going well for Haman in this part. This is in chapter 6, by the way, verse 10. It says, "Then the king said to Haman, 'Hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned.' And so Haman took the robes and the horse and dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.' And then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered." That means he was shameful. Really, really rough stuff. Now, it gets better. Esther has a second banquet. And she invites the king and Haman again to come to this wonderful banquet. And this time, she says to the king, "I'm a Jew." And this is shocking to both the king and Haman. And then she says, "And Haman is plotting to kill not only me, but all of my people." And this, of course, makes the king furious. And so, you know what the king says? "You know what, Haman? You need to die for this." And it just so happens that some of the people in my court, randomly, without my knowledge, constructed this incredible stake. And I'm now sentencing you to die upon it. And Haman is thrown and impaled on the stake that he erected for Mordecai. It's just this really crazy drama. I love it. This is why I'm telling you, the story's great. It's fantastic. This happens in chapter 7. This is verses 7 through 10. "And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking." Again, wrath and wine drinking. I mean, we don't have to make an argument for this, folks. It's not good when you drink a lot. "And went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where he was drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, 'Will he even assault the queen in my presence and my own house?' And as the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. And then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, 'Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high.' And the king said, 'Hang him on that.' And he died." Gallows, by the way, more likely a stake, just for what it's worth. The Jews are vindicated, of course, after all of this takes place. Mordecai is elevated to an even higher status. But then they still have this problem. Month of Adar is coming up. King signed a decree that means all the Jewish people will be put to death. And they discover this wrinkle in their plan, that once a king makes a decree, he can't reverse it. So all of them must be put to death. And this is what they come up with. This is their plan. Is you can't reverse the decree. But what you could do is make another decree that says anyone who attacks a Jewish person, the Jewish person can fight back and kill and not be punished. And thus the decree is made, and many of Haman's family attacks, and they're all killed, and the Jews fight back and win, and everyone is happy, right? And I love this. At the end, in chapter 9, we get this, by the way, the vindication of them. "Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's province also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them. But they laid no hands on the plunder. This is on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made that day a feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th day and rested on the 15th day, making the day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who live in the rural towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts to food for one another." And then it goes on to talk about this feast that is inaugurated called the Feast of Purim, which is a play off dice. Pure, right? Purim. And it is to be celebrated 2 days in a succession leading up to the Passover. Really amazing stuff. Of course, at the end of this, there's a little bit more about Mordecai. And here's the big takeaway from Esther, is that even in the so-called absence of God, and certainly in a lack of morality, God does not abandon his people. He's still at work behind the scenes. Even if he's not an active force that can be seen or perceived explicitly, God does not take his hands off of his sovereign plans. He continues to work. We get a little bit of an allusion to this in Esther chapter 4. All the way back in 4:14, when they are preparing the banquet and they're preparing the initial plans to try to save the Jewish people, Mordecai and Esther, it says starting in verse 12, and they told Mordecai what Esther had said, and then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. So Mordecai is convinced, even if you don't speak up, deliverance is going to happen. Now notice, he doesn't say God is going to deliver us. He just says deliverance is going to come from some other place. And then he says this, and who knows whether or not you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Maybe, Esther, you are here, and maybe you are beautiful, and you caught this guy's attention so that you could become queen, and you could institute the change needed to save our people. Who knows? But if not you, it'll happen some other way. There's almost an echo of sovereignty involved in this. It's really a fascinating thing. So I love Esther because there's no activity at all of God. God is not even mentioned in this book, and yet clearly he is working behind the scenes. Now I'm gonna wrap this up with one of my favorite tie-ins, and this is purely speculative, but I think it has a lot of credibility. In John chapter 5, John's gospel, more than any of the others, pays attention to the feasts and the celebrations that Jesus goes to. There's a reason for that, and more time to explain it than I have time for here. But what's interesting is that in chapter 9, you get this whole healing at the pool on the Sabbath and Bethesda. There's this man, and he's up by this pool, and he would lay there, and the way that this pool in Bethesda worked, according to history and tradition, is that an angel would come by and like swirl the waters, and if you jumped in right at the right time, then you'd be healed. And so paralyzed people and sick people would always lay out there, and they would take turns kind of getting in and out of it in hopes that it might take, right, and they might be healed. And chapter 5 begins with this really, really quick little description of time. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So this is following chapter 4, where he heals this official's son, and there's a few other things that take place that kind of give us a point of time in Jesus' ministry when this is all happening. But this is the only instance in John's gospel where a feast is mentioned, and it's not named. We have the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Tabernacles. There's all kinds, the Passover, they're always mentioned. This is the one time in John's Gospel where it's not mentioned. And if you look at the time frame of how all of this unfolds, the Feast of Purim would fall right at this point. And so there is this thought, it's again speculative, but there is this thought that this is John's way of nodding to Esther. By not naming the feast, he's nodding to the fact that Esther doesn't name God. But that in that book, the Feast of Purim is inaugurated. And so it's an interesting play on Jewish tradition that John may or may not have been intending. It may or may not have been the Feast of Purim, but it certainly lines up pretty well date-wise. And it makes a lot of sense why he wouldn't name it in honor of Esther that doesn't name God's name. Pretty cool. Pretty cool little concept there. Any other thoughts, questions, or concerns before we end? Yeah. Oh, hold on. Wait, where's the box? Oh, she's going for it. Here it is. Woo! It was a par 3. You birdied. Good.
Okay, so it's been mentioned a couple of times that once the king, I feel like maybe I've even asked this question already, is like once a king makes a decree, they can't undo it. But like, why? I mean, in this case, like this king's not even a God-fearing king. Like it's not like there are checks and balances. Like this guy's not accountable to anybody. Like
Yeah.
who? So I guess when you say the king can't reverse the decree, who says?
Yeah. That's a good question. Tradition.
Okay.
I mean, and that seems really strange, but like when you consider how tradition so dominates virtually every culture, you could ask that question about 1,000 things. Why? But why though? You know, and there's not really a good explanation for it other than that there was probably some superstition attached to it that says like if a king goes back on his decree, then like his kingdom will be crumbled, or you know, something weird like that. I mean, that's the kind of thing that typically dominates traditional thoughts and concepts, that if you don't honor the old ways, then the old gods will strike back somehow at you.
Yeah.
And yeah, that it's so it's a good question, but it's one that I think could be waged upon virtually every culture. There's a lot of practices that we have that are like, why do we do that? Who says? We just do it, you know? And it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's what we follow.
I have one other quick one, if that's cool.
Absolutely, we've got plenty of time.
You'd mentioned in how Esther closes that Mordecai and her having this conversation about how, just alluding to the idea that like, hey, maybe Esther, you can be the change for the Jewish people that we want to see. But that was not really on her mind when throwing her hat in the ring for this beauty pageant now, was it? I mean, I always viewed it as she was just attempting to kind of improve her standing.
Yeah.
Try and get in good with the king.
I think that's absolutely an okay reading of that. Because otherwise it wouldn't really make sense for Mordecai to say that. You know, and furthermore, Haman hadn't risen to power when she was in this whole thing, and because everything that takes place, the beauty pageant happens, he thinks she's beautiful, he immediately promotes her, and then what happens is Mordecai overhears the plot to kill the king. He tells Esther, she tells the king, he has them knocked off, Mordecai gets the credit, and then he marries Esther. So that's actually the thing that kind of promotes her to queen status. And then in chapter 3, Haman rises to power, and that's when the problems begin. So, yeah, I don't think she has any like impetus at all to try to like be an agent of change in the kingdom. I just think she's just thinking like, you know, I've seen myself and I'm okay on the eyes, and he's looking for an okay on the eyes bride, and might as well, you know, and it works out. Now, I think the way we're supposed to read it is God is the one behind the scenes making this happen. It's just not clear and present in the story. Vashti, is that who you're talking about? The first wife? Yeah, I mean, yeah, so it's hard to, yeah, I mean, I think she just sought an opportunity. Again, throwing your wife away because she wasn't obedient or whatever sounds horrible, but like pretty par for the course in this time. Yeah, so let's throw the box. Here, I want to just for the people at home, if that's okay. Here, Tyler, look at that. I'm a pro. Wow. Amazing.
Hello.
Hi.
I just kind of wanted to comment to what the man in the front asked about why couldn't they whatever decree they made, why did they have to stick to it? When I just think about, when I look in the Bible about just that other kings, how they've all made just different decrees and they had to stick to it, like even thinking about King Herod and when he beheaded John the Baptist. Even though it wasn't like an official decree, I guess, but he still did it because he said it. And so when I think about it, even with Daniel and the king at that time, I think it's more of a pride thing as to where if they say something, they have to do what they say. Otherwise, their kingdom will look at them as though they're not men of their words. And so I guess it weakens. It weakens their word to where their word won't hold any weight if they go back on what they said. And so, it reminds me, it's a scripture in Proverbs. It talks about not to let our words trap us. And so, the reason why our words can trap us, because it's not as though we can't take back or undo something we said, but pride will always come in if I say, okay, well, this is what I'm going to do. But if I don't do it or if I can't do it, pride will cause me to continue to do what I already put up to, what I already said I was going to do. And so I think it's more so not just a traditional thing, but more so of a pride thing that we see happening in a lot of these kings. And since they don't answer to the living God, they don't understand humility. And that's kind of all.
No, that's spot on. I mean, and to be clear, what going back on your word indicates is failure at some level. And so for an ungodly king, that's unacceptable because I can't be seen as someone who fails. Right. And in a lot of these cases, I don't know about in Babylon, I haven't studied Babylonian culture well enough. I know in Egyptian culture, you're seen as a like lowercase deity.
Right.
And so there's no questioning the Pharaoh, a god in his own right. And that same kind of mindset, though, is so prevalent in every major leader, and even in some of the godly kings. And so it is a kingdom built on a lack of repentance or a lack of being willing to admit failure is a kingdom doomed to a lot of degrees. And this kingdom really should have been, if not for the wisdom of Mordecai and Esther to undo that. What I think is fascinating about that is a really great comment, is that the rush to change the scenario up is really oriented towards saving Israel, not changing the Persian kingdom. If God wanted to, he could have said like, hey, king, you can go back on your decree. All you have to do is just say, hey, I made a mistake. Haman misled me, and I was, whatever, and so we need to not kill these people, and you need to follow after your king, and if you make a mistake, he could have done that. But God's mission wasn't to reform Persia. It was to protect Israel. And so there's kind of this like double-edged sword of, pun intended, of like, if I make the second decree, 75,000 Persians who hated Jewish people were killed. So it was kind of like a two-bird, one-stone scenario, I think, as well. Great comment. I love that. That's fantastic. Any other questions, comments? Yeah, right over here. I'm going to throw the box. It's soft. Woo! It's never going to get old. I'm going to do that forever, I think. Go ahead.
Made me lose my train of thought now.
Woo!
Oh, okay. So 2 comments. One was, didn't he call all the women? So it wasn't, maybe my VeggieTales is coming out here. I don't know. But
if you'd like to.
Make me a sandwich.
Yeah.
No, didn't the king call all of the women? Not just, so it wasn't like Esther chose.
Well, let's consult the text and find out.
One more thing while you're doing that.
Yeah.
I feel like you left out the best part about Haman's punishment was, his when he had to parade through the streets.
Yes.
That was all his idea, thinking that it was for himself.
Right.
So
yes.
I thought that was
yes.
a great piece of thing that.
It is a great piece of thing. Now, he was not notably a zucchini in this.
True.
I just do want to clarify that for you as well. Let's see here. It says that, chapter 2, verse 2. Then the king's young men who attended him, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. Yeah, I don't think that's every woman.
Okay.
I
think
it's the beautiful young virgins of everyone. That's key. I'm just saying, it's a key thing. Yeah, it may have been. I don't know that it had much to do with her choice. I think that, again, she seems like not interested in this setup. So I don't know that if it were, I think it was probably a little bit of both and. She's not like, oh, I can't do that. I don't want to, but I guess I have to. It's like, she seems like, okay, I'll jump in the ring. What could go wrong?
She is a Jew.
Right, but she conceals that. And that's an interesting thing. I think sometimes we think that, like, she would have looked Jewish. But it doesn't seem like that in this story. It's not like he saw what she looked like. She had to literally tell both Haman and the king that she was a Jew. So I think by concealing it, that just means that she just wasn't telling people. And he did give her, lots of cosmetics. So, what a ridiculous part of that story. Gosh. Ugh. What a typical guy. Unbelievable. Where's the cookware? Did she get a vacuum as well? I mean, come on. Like, what? Why not just throw it all on there? It's just so typical. So typical. Anything else? We're 1 minute over now. Oh, go ahead.
Do you have a bibliography on your blog for your sources that you use, the resources?
Bibliography? No, I make everything up.
No. I'm just wondering, like, if there's a main, like, resource that you can sell for your Old Testament study.
Yeah. I don't have it on my blog. I could put it on there. It's pretty comprehensive. It would be pretty hard to come by, but you're certainly welcome to look at it. There are a couple of options that I think if you wanted to do some, like, really good digging, Longman and Dillard have an Old Testament survey book that's like this thick. It's by Zondervan, and there's actually an Old Testament, New Testament, and then Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology that are all produced in that same set that would be, like, super helpful for pretty much anyone. I use commentaries, but those are going to be where you're gonna have.
What set of commentaries do you use?
So I use New American Commentaries as one of my primary sets, which is about 45 volumes in that set. I use the Anchor Yale commentary, which is I think 81 because it includes Apocrypha, and there's a couple of others that are doubled up. I use the New International Commentary on the Old and New Testaments, NICOT, and you can't really abbreviate the other one, NICNT. For New Testament, I prefer Pillar New Testament. I think it's really good. It's edited by a lot of guys that I revere as, like, top New Testament scholars. I still consult Kyle and Delitzsch a little bit. It's about a 100-year-old commentary now, but it was a mainstay in Old Testament study. They were Hebrew specialists. They were incredible. I feel like I'm missing one. I have an ancient Christian commentary that pulls from all of the patristic and basically from the Dark Ages down commentaries written on every book in Old and New. And then if you wanted a good place to begin, the Bible Knowledge Commentary is a pretty good one, the BKC. It's very abridged, so that's why I say it's a good place to begin. All of these commentary sets I'm talking about in print would cost you somewhere between $7,000 and $15,000. So I have them digitally. They're still pretty expensive, but I've built them up over 10 years. And so 1 year I've saved up a lot. Like I bought the Yale commentary series. It was still pretty expensive, but I'm a doctoral student, and so I need commentaries and sources that are acceptable. As far as surveys, and there's a lot of other things that I consult with, so let me say this as well. This is the last thing I'll say. I know we're going a little long here tonight, but it's fine. If you want to get really great snapshots for, like, overarching storylines of Bible books, the Bible Project is phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. Tim Mackey is an Old Testament specialist, has his PhD in Old Testament studies. They have really great little illustrations. They're fantastic. Really, really, really highly recommend. So go and buy none of those books. I will say, actually, remind them about, I will do that in a minute, Kels. I will say in half-price books, in the Bible and commentary sections, you can sometimes find some really great Bible commentaries in there. But what you need to understand is that in these sets that I'm talking about, they are book to book. So if you're studying the Book of Esther, it's going to be an Esther commentary. That's all you're going to get. You're going to get an Ezra Nehemiah commentary or a John commentary. In fact, in Anchor, John has two. It's part 1 and part 2 because there's so much to say. So, but you can sometimes find them, and they're really, really helpful to have on hand if you don't have access to Accordance or Logos or something like that. Last but not least, Intergenerational is next week, so we will not be meeting in here. That will be the Wednesday next, so the 17th, and then the following one, the 24th, we won't be meeting at all. There's no classes on that night. Last but not least, this coming Sunday, the 14th, 6 p.m., we will be doing Night of Worship, and we'll be taking Lord's Supper that night. Yours truly is going to hit the drums as hard as I possibly can, and I think Kelsey's even going to let me sing a song, praise God. So, a lot of fun. We'll have a good time. I hope you'll come. I hope you'll worship. We've got Kelsey's been working on incorporating the head, hands, and heart emphasis into the Night of Worship structure. So we're going to do a couple things that are a little bit different this time that I think are going to really bless you. So I hope you'll be here for that. Bless y'all. See you next time. 6 to 7:15. Yep. See y'all next time.